Hi, I'm Amanda Brown from Fabric Heart, and today we're going to make this beautiful rag quilt together. Really, this quilt could not be easier. I can't wait to share the process with you. This project is pretty straightforward. We're going to cut blocks all to the same size. We're going to put one piece of flannel face down. We're going to put the next middle filling layer. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have a final piece on top. So we're going to take these and then we're going to sew diagonal lines from corner to corner. And then when we sew each piece together, we can then snip our seam allowances. So these are two pieces, well there's three pieces here. I've sewn corner to corner and then I sew them with my seam allowances exposed, and when I open them up then I can cut my seam allowances to give us this frilly look. It's a really easy method but really effective. Before we get into exactly how much of everything we need, let's talk about your options because there are so many options with these rag quilts. You can use any fabric you want that is a woven. You could use a flannel, which is what I'm going to be using. It's traditionally what a lot of people use, but you could also just use a quilter's cotton or any other cotton fabric that is woven. The idea here is when we cut the seam allowances after we sew everything together, that's what fluffs up and gives us the look we want. If you use something like flannel, you're going to get a lot of fraying. That is ideal for me, but that might not be ideal for you. If you use a tightly woven cotton, you might not get as much fraying as you would like. So you kind of have to play around with that and decide the look that you want. So I highly suggest doing that. Play around with it. Cut smaller pieces and try it out. And that's what I did for this project. I initially, when I started this project, thought about putting just quilt batting in the middle, but that quickly changed. Some people just use a solid flannel in the middle. You could use minky, which is a super silky polyester. It's incredibly warm. One side has the design on it and the other side is flat. And then the other one that you could use is a really nice fleece. And this fleece here is almost like a micro fleece, so it's not too bulky. You could put that in the middle. I decided that I wanted to play around with all these to get the look that I was really going for. So I want to share with you what that looks like. Originally, I had thought about using just some quilt batting. So in this piece here, I have a little bit of quilt batting that's in between each layer. I didn't have it go all the way into the seam allowance, which allowed me to not worry about the quilt batting and how it will fray. So I kind of like this, but the seam allowances in here, they weren't, or the fuzzy parts weren't looking exactly how I liked them. So then I tried it with your flannel, just a white flannel in there, and I did like the look of this a lot more than the one with just the quilt batting in the middle. So definitely this would be on my favorite list. And then I tried this with minky, and although minky is super soft and cuddly and it's going to stay nice and solid in your seam allowance because it's not going to unravel, I didn't like that one side wasn't that fuzzy. It was a little bit more shiny and I didn't like that look. So that was a no for me. But then I did this one, and this is the fleece, and I really liked how it looked. And I also like knowing that even if all of my flannel kind of frays apart, that I'm still going to have some substance in there, and those seam allowances in here are going to look great. So then I came down to the decision between the two, and in the end I just really liked how the fleece looked, so I'm going to go with the fleece one for my project today. But you can decide to use whatever material for the middle layer that you want. For this quilt today, I am using 6.5 inch blocks. So that means I need a 6.5 inch block of the top, the backing, and the middle layer for each square of this quilt. I am making it 44 inches by 50 inches, give or take a little bit. And so that means I am going to need 2 yards of fabric for the top layer, 2 for the back, and approximately 2 for the middle. Since I'm using fleece, and fleece tends to be a little bit wider for the middle, I probably don't need the full 2 yards, but I mean, I'll use it for something. I have 3 fabrics for the top layer, I have my backing fabric, and then I have my fleece. And note, if you are using a flannel in this project, I highly suggest you pre-wash your flannels. I know we debate a lot on whether to pre-wash fabrics or not. Flannels are one of those ones where they kind of change a lot after your first wash, And to avoid disappointment, give them a wash first, give them a dry, and that way you're done with a whole bunch of the linting and the shrinkage before you start making your beautiful quilt. Let's go over the tools you need today. You will want a sewing machine, but outside of your sewing machine, these are the things that we're going to use. I'm using my OLFA Rotary Mat. Because I'm working with fleece, I'm using my 60mm OLFA rotary cutter. This, with fleece, makes it a lot easier to cut. I have 2 different rulers here. This is up to you. I like to cut my fabric strips with my 6 by 12 inch ruler, but really what I'm focusing on a lot of my cutting is with the 6.5 inch square ruler. Honestly, if I was just using this ruler, I would make my blocks 6 inches by 6 inches because I don't want to have to deal with that 1/2 inch. But this beautiful 6.5 inch square ruler, it's my favorite, and it makes cutting everything for this so much easier. And very important are my OLFA Appliqué scissors. These are what we're going to snip all of our seam allowances with, and they are a miracle worker here. We're going to start cutting all of our 6.5 inch pieces. So first off, I'm going to take my yardage, I'm going to fold it in half so that I have a piece that is small enough to fit on my cutting mat. I'm going to lay this down, and I'm going to actually use the lines on my cutting mat today. I'm going to line my piece up on the 4 inch mark there. This line, just make sure it's nice and straight. And then I'm going to use my other ruler, and I'm going to line that up, this edge here, with my 4.5 inch mark. And this is going to allow me to get my 6.5 inch strip cut. Once it's cut, then I'm going to switch over to the smaller ruler. What I've learned with my flannel that I have, and your flannel might be different, is that I need almost all of it. So right here, I'm just cheating my seam allowance over a little bit so that I have it lined up with the folded edge of my selvage, so that when I put this down, I'm going to even move it just a little bit more. When I put that down, that I know I'm not going to be cutting off too much of my fabric. If they're a little bit wonky, that's okay. So if this is the first time cutting fabric, it's a great project because it's really forgiving. Even if your squares don't line up perfectly or are slightly different sizes, when we sew them together, we're cutting into the seam allowance, you're not going to notice. So I'm cutting those ones, and then I've opened up this folded piece, and that allows me to get 2 more pieces because I have 2 layers there. Just like that. So I'm going to do that with the rest of the fabric that I have that I need to cut for this quilt. One thing I'm mindful to do as I'm cutting is every time I put my rotary cutter down, I'm going to make sure that I have closed it. Safety first. Once you have all your pieces cut out, it's now time to assemble each of the blocks to get them ready to be sewn together. Take one of your backing blocks and place it face down. Next, layer your middle layer, whatever you have chosen. And then finish it off with one of your top pieces of fabric. Make sure if you have any orientation of fabrics that you have things lined up the way you want them. So you're going to repeat this for all of the fabrics that you have so that you have all of your units together. There's no need to pin these or add anything in between the layers to make sure that they stick together. These fabrics, especially flannels, they stick together very nicely and they won't really shift around a lot while you're sewing. I've now made my piles of all the fabrics all lined up, and it's time to move on to the next part, which is sewing them together. So I'm going to use a marking tool to mark my squares from corner to corner to give me an X across the top of each square. Or you can eyeball it on your sewing machine, which is what I'm going to do with most of mine. But if you're feeling a little hesitant about eyeballing, if you line up your ruler on your square and mark corner to corner with your favorite marking tool that will erase, this is a hair marker, it just leaves an indent. So you can do that, and you're going to do that for each of the blocks, and then you're going to sew on that diagonal line to make an X on each of your blocks. Since we're working with some bulky layers here, I am actually using a walking foot. This is really helpful. It helps move all the layers through your machine at the same rate,
but if you don't have a walking foot, just take your time and make sure nothing is shifting too much. I'm going to sew each block in one direction. Right here I'm chain piecing, which is fancy for I'm just not cutting the thread between blocks. I'm going to chain piece in one direction from corner to corner, and then I'm going to cut all my pieces apart, flip them around, and then sew the opposite diagonal line.
Once you have all of your blocks sewn with the X on, it's time to piece them together. So make sure you have them in the right order when you sew them together, and make sure if you have any directional fabrics that you have them the right way around. We're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're going to put the backs together. Just line them up so your backs of your fabric are together, and we're going to sew a 1/2 inch down each block. My yellow stripe, my rainbow, my pink, my rainbow, this is my pattern, my yellow stripe, and then I'm going to sew my next rainbow one on here, and I'm going to complete the row. And I'm going to do that for each of the 8 rows. Don't sew all the rows together yet. Wait until the next step.
This is definitely when things get a little thick. We have 6 layers here. One trick is to make sure your foot is completely on your fabric before you start sewing. Then backtrack so that you sew the entire seam, but that will make sure your foot is nice and flat and can grab evenly.
Now that I have a row together, it is time to break out my applique scissors and start to clip my seam allowances. I'm going to take each one where we have 2 blocks joined, and I'm going to start to snip up the seam allowances. And I want to be a little bit methodical about this. One thing is we kind of want one in the middle, but we're going to be sewing our next rows together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We kind of want to make sure that we have a clip kind of where we're going to be sewing that seam together, and it just helps ease the next part together. So I want to make sure I have those ones, and then it's kind of up to personal preference on how closely you put those snips together, but try to be consistent between all of your rows and blocks. One thing to remember is don't clip your stitches. If you do that, it will come unraveled. So if you accidentally clip one, take it back to the sewing machine and make sure you go over that section to make sure that it is sewn completely together. Go ahead and do this for every row that you have, the blocks in between each one. If you find it's hard on your hands to go through all layers at once, you can break it up and do 1/2 and 1/2. So if I wanted to put another one here, I could do 1/2 here and then go down and do the second 1/2 down here. So feel free to play around with that to get exactly the look that you want for your entire quilt. And once you've done between one block, you're going to move on to the next one. So you're going to do that for all 8 rows, and then come back here and we will sew each row together. Once you have each individual row done and you've clipped the seam allowances, then it's time to sew the rows all together. So I have here 2 of my first rows, and I'm going to, the same way as we've done the other one, is our backs are going to be together, our back sides are to be together, and we're going to line everything up and then sew them together. But here I'm going to make sure, just to make it easier while sewing, that my seam allowances are kind of split to either side. So I'm going to pin these together or clip them together, whatever works best for you, just so I make sure that they're all lined up and that they'll be able to be stitched together without any problems. And always make sure that your right side's up with your backing so that you don't get any surprises. So line those up, and once they're all pinned together, then you're going to sew them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance.
And we are almost done here. We have all of our rows put together, and now it's time to deal with the cutting in between the rows and how we are going to finish the outside edge, which there's a couple different options. You could bind it, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rag it just like the rest of the quilt. So I'm going to stitch around the outside of the quilt, And I'm going to, just to be cautious, I'm going to do 2 rows 1/8 of an inch apart, a 1/2 inch in from the edge, but 2 rows just in case I snip one of those outside edges. It's going to have a lot of wear and tear on that outside edge, so that second line of stitching will just give me a little bit of insurance, but you don't need to do that if you don't want to. Sewing across the top is pretty straightforward. It's when we turn the corner, I'm just going to pivot at the corner. You could sew off the edge and start again. I'll pivot here. When I come down the sides of the quilt, we haven't snipped those seam allowances along the side yet. So I'm going to try to lay them flat so that I have not extra bulk on like all of those 6 layers of extra bulk on one side. So I will lay them flat down the middle, so I have 3 extra layers on one side and 3 on the other, and this will just keep things a little bit easier to sew through. And then when we take it off and we go to snip those seam allowances, then I will just snip those really close to that stitch line, so it allows that to lay or to bulk up and fluff up like we want it.
Now it's all sewn together. I have my 2 lines sewn around my edge, and the last step, well, the second to last step, is I'm going to snip all of my edges and make it all nice and fluffy. And once that's done, we are going to throw it in the washer and dryer to crinkle it up and get those edges nice and fluffy. Note, you're going to put this in the washer, you're going to dry it. Always, after this type of project, you're going to want to make sure that you clean out your dryer lint. If you don't know how to remove the lint from your dryer, I suggest looking it up online and making sure you do that. Go ahead and snip all of your seam allowances, and the project is almost done.
This is what I was talking about before. We are going to snip close to that stitch line to free up that fabric so that we can then divide up and snip each little section. These scissors I love, they're super sharp right all the way to the point, and you get a lot of precision there. And so I'm going to snip those up to match what I've done in between each of the blocks when I was sewing the rows together. This is the perfect time to settle in with your favorite TV or movie or audiobook and just get into the zone of clipping all of these seam allowances. It's going to take you a little bit of time, but I promise you it's going to be worth it in the end.
And just like that, our quilt is done. I've snipped all the seam allowances. The back is just as beautiful as the front. All that needs to be done now is for it to be popped into the washer and dryer so that it is extremely fluffy. Thank you for joining me and OLFA as we made this rag quilt together.